Welcome, everybody. Today, we're going to talk about blockchain, and we have got more files in blockchain in the last 6 months. It's unbelievable.
I always get asked this question about the adoption of blockchain and how long that's going to take. And it's funny you picked 5 years because I actually think 5 years is the right timeline. There's a tremendous amount of inertia right now in trying to understand just the sheer implications of what blockchain can do. And one of the challenges that the TMX had was really to understand the technology. Like, you really need to understand the merits of what the technology can do and the benefits of what it can yield. And then you need to actually go and look at specific use cases around what that blockchain can actually solve. And a lot of times over the last, I'll call it 2, maybe 3 years, where there's been a tremendous amount of proliferation to try and understand how this could be applied, one of the things that was very clear was it doesn't solve absolutely everything. And so is blockchain going to completely change the world completely in 5 years? Probably not. But will it change the world? Absolutely yes. And what I mean by that is, in the world of finance, when you go and pay for something, if you go downstairs and you go to Starbucks and you order your coffee and you tap with Apple Pay or your credit card or whatever it might be, on the back end rails, there's a whole slew of steps in getting the money that you just tapped from your bank account to Starbucks. It's not a simple thing. And if you think about what blockchain can do, it can streamline that. So the implications of that are quite massive and large, meaning that a whole whack of industry is going to evolve and mature. And a lot of the inefficiencies that you see today are ultimately going to be gone.
Picture yourself in the early 1990s, well, maybe half of you were not even born at that time, but trying to exercise that prophetic insight as to where the internet was going to go. And that's really the moment at which we're at with blockchain technology, is we're all trying to figure out where is this all going and what's the implication of all of this. And so if you talk to the purists in the blockchain world, they would say that, particularly with platforms like Ethereum, anybody heard of Ethereum here? Okay, we have a few people. Actually a Canadian-based blockchain. So some of them are actually our clients, some of the co-founders of Ethereum. And so they say that that future that you see in the movies will come alive through things like a blockchain, Ethereum, smart contract platform. And so it's a really exciting time right now to try to be on the front line and help shape the regulation. And this is a bit of a dodging way of trying to answer your question as to what will happen in the next 5 years. I'm really not sure. I mean, I think we'll now start seeing, we see a lot of our clients in every single industry, and Ralph had mentioned insurance, banking, capital markets, many, many others. All of them are actively engaged, trying to come up with use cases and prototypes and this and that. And so we're going to start seeing those released and what the legal issues with them are and this and that. And so this coming 5 years is really going to be that critical period to find out where this is all going. Will it all go tremendously well? Will there be issues with it, et cetera, et cetera? That's all being worked out.
It can be argued that blockchain structural security and immutability offer advantages over traditional data stores. Blockchain can also provide efficiency and speed. Each of these are readily applicable to public sector organizations. Hence, many government leaders are exploring its uses in government. However, blockchain does impose at least 2 risks on the government. Blockchain's unknown technical risks may make it a dangerous tool for government agencies, considering the need for a low-tolerance risk system. Additionally, blockchain may create a political issue as instituting a decentralized safety network eliminates the need for a central authority who controls a database. Therefore, it may feel as though power is being lost. With that being said, do you think blockchain is an appropriate tool to be used by the government? And if so, where do you believe blockchain should be adopted?
When I think about blockchain, it can be applied in a multiple series of industry. And if you think about government, there are a few that do come to mind. Let me just paint you a picture. If you look at just the health system, for example, and you go to a doctor, and you say, yeah, I need to go and get my checkup, and you fill out a whole whack of forms. And then after that, you go and do your checkup, and you realize, no, you know what? I want to go and change my doctors. Yet you have to go and fill out those forms again. And if they refer you to a specialist because they found something, heaven forbid, you have to fill out some more forms. Let's say something else happens and you have to go to another hospital, yet you have to fill out a bunch of forms. And when you look at it, it's highly repetitive. They're trying to understand who you are, what's the current situation, what are they looking for, et cetera. And if you think about a decentralized network around your information, your health, how much more efficient would that experience be for you when wherever you go, that information goes with you? So that's the concept of a decentralized world. And this is, a big thing that everyone is looking at, especially as it pertains to privacy and the ability to share the contents of what's private, like your identity in a public environment. That's one. If you think about something else that could potentially be private, and let's take, for example, a financial transaction. That could be a private or a closed network where you have a multitude of nodes. The concept is still the same, except instead of it just being way out there, you've got a series of trusted parties that can actually go in and work together to contain what you call a private node. And if you want to go and move your bank accounts between, let's say, CIBC and BMO, or between TD and RBC, just the concept of going through that account opening process and the laundry list of papers that you need to fill out, imagine not even having to worry about that because all of that information is readily available. And so there are definitely applicabilities on how you could do it. The concepts of the maturity of the technology, obviously before we go and adopt it, just like anything else, there's probably going to be some growing pains. But that's sort of along the lines of what Usman was saying earlier, where there's a whole bunch of prototyping experimentation that's going on right now that is truly stressing the technology. And when you do that, the engineers, the guys that have open sourced all this are actually going in and making the edits and corrections. And you're starting to see the robustness and the stability of the underpinning technology get stronger and stronger at a pace that just blows my mind because I can barely keep up.
The internet mentions that you're authoring an upcoming book called The Law of Blockchain Technology. Today, there are more than 1,000 cryptocurrencies actively trading on the financial market. Does the book mention how the laws are regulating and affecting the adoption of blockchain technology? Also, do you believe that most cryptocurrencies on the market are declining because of regulatory and concerns and questions it arises?
So we're writing a book on the law of blockchain technology. As you can probably imagine, it's this very difficult, never-ending process because the law is constantly evolving in this space. It's almost as if every week goes by, there's a new law, there's a new regulation, there's a new amendment on the books, there's a new position that is being taken by a regulator with respect to something or another involving cryptos. So we're trying to cover the field by addressing all different aspects of cryptocurrencies. So to the first question that you have, if I recall it correctly, is yes, we're planning to look at all of the regulatory aspects surrounding cryptocurrencies. Now, you asked as well about whether regulation is impacting the value of cryptocurrencies, if I recall it correctly. And I think it is. I mean, so let me ask you this. So how many of you here, if anyone, I'd be surprised if there was no one, hold cryptocurrencies? Okay.
Oh, is that me? I
Yeah.
should have.
So as it turns out, John here is a crypto billionaire.
No, I saw a hand at the back, a guy there.
No, there's quite a
Well,
there's a number of people
A few
here.
people, okay.
So what would happen, let's say, if you couldn't convert that crypto into fiat, so USD or Canadian or yen, because any of the exchanges that you could transfer those cryptos through to another person or to convert them to fiat were shut down? And so one of the big issues right now is with respect to exchanges. I mean, what rules, what laws really apply to them? Should they be governed as the Toronto Stock Exchange? Should they be governed in some other fashion? That's just one of the issues that people are dealing with. And once a regulator or a government moves to affect exchanges or some of the other critical aspects or moves to regulate, there's almost like a shock to the system for a number of the cryptocurrencies. And so we see that kind of reverberate. And we've seen, for example, South Korea, China make movements against cryptocurrencies. And so it definitely has, I mean, I don't have a line of causation, but timing-wise, it appears to be the case that regulation and the hint of regulation could definitely impact it. So one of the big issues that a number of our banking clients have with cryptocurrencies is that you can't really do proper KYC AML checks. You can't ensure, so KYC is know your client or customer, and AML is anti-money laundering. So they have to make sure that they're complying with laws, that they're not facilitating terrorism and terrorist financing. And so how do you do that with Bitcoin, where it's a pseudo-anonymous kind of ledger, where you can see all the transactions, but you don't really know who's behind them? So that's a big issue for a number of governments, a number of banks, a number of legislatures, and we're going to see in the coming years, in the coming months, frankly, a lot of development on that side to address that, among many other issues. So.
With over 20 years of involvement in both business and technology, you have gained experience in global payments. Under the current system, sending money across the world is insufficient, as wire transfers and fees are high, and it could take several days for a recipient to receive the funds. Cryptocurrencies help solve both issues, as the fees are much lower and the transaction speed is anywhere from a few seconds to 45 minutes. We have gotten used to the Canadian dollar, US dollar, euro, and Japanese yen, and a lot more currencies, and even gold. So why haven't more banks adopted cryptocurrencies for global payments as of yet?
If you think about some of these cryptocurrencies, and again, I'm not going to look at these tokens with one slate for all of them. I mean, they are different depending on the attributes of which cryptocurrency you're looking at. But if you look at Ethereum or Ether and Bitcoin, these things are perceptions of value or stores of value. And the intended audience for what Bitcoin was when it was first created was that actual reason to say, I want to go and use this as a value store to buy something or sell something or move value across borders without having to worry about it. The problem is if you actually try to do that today, you have to ask yourself, okay, if I'm going to move 1,000 Canadian dollars and move it to South Korea, to the won, and you know that you can actually do the wire, go through a whole slew of correspondent bank networks. There's probably some fees along the way, but eventually it gets there after, call it 3 days or 4 days. So, and depending on how many hops, some of these can take a lot longer. The value of store there remains somewhat constant. In a perfect world where there was stability in the pricing of what Bitcoin is or Ether is, your argument stands true. It could happen. But what is happening right now? The volatility is actually hurting the intended purpose of what Bitcoin was. And so if you think about even trying to go, and I'll use the coffee thing because I love doing the coffee bit. If you think about the intended purpose of a Bitcoin, it was to go and buy goods, buy things, replace fiat completely. And this is where the purists will come in and say, that's what it was intended for. Oh yeah, screw you, government. But if you had one Bitcoin right now, and you had 2 Canadian dollars right now, and you went down to the Starbucks, and let's just say for hypothetical situation, they actually would accept the Bitcoin. Would you buy that coffee with the Bitcoin, or would you buy that with the Canadian dollar? You choose, exactly. Why would you take that risk? Because of the volatility of a Bitcoin, that could become an extremely expensive cup of coffee, right?
Or free.
Or free, yeah, that's right. Actually, it could completely tank, but you don't know. But the point is the volatility of it and that perceived value of store. When you buy that coffee at that point in time, the confidence you have in the fiat currency is significantly greater because you know that value of store is relatively constant. And yes, the Canadian dollar does move, but does it move or swing $1,000 every 4 hours? No. And so when you think about that, the intended use of it is very, very different. And of course, not to mention, the legal ramifications of the legitimacy of the currency itself is what the governments are having a very difficult time in actually acknowledging, hence the banks themselves. And that's sort of the reason why you haven't seen this massive adoption.
One of your areas of expertise is cryptocurrency litigation. I'm curious to know what are the most common types of litigation that you see in such a new and disruptive industry such as cryptocurrency? And what do you suggest companies and individuals do to protect themselves from risk when getting involved with cryptocurrencies?
In the early days, tons of litigation in the criminal area, okay? So unfortunately, Bitcoin got tarnished, sort of like the internet as well in the early days with criminality and this and that, because it was new and it was certain features of it lent itself to facilitating crime. So the early cases that everyone hears about in the criminal litigation sphere are the Silk Road Trilogy cases, which is really this underground, underweb, dark web operation that you could use to basically buy murder for hire, narcotics, any type of other contraband, and the underlying payment system was Bitcoin. And so the FBI, through various mechanisms and procedures, were able to commence prosecutions against a number of those individuals and shut it down. So we saw in the early days a lot of criminal prosecutions involving Bitcoin. And the features, again, just to elaborate a little bit, Bitcoin is a pseudo-anonymous ledger. So again, you can't, although you can see all the transactions right to the Genesis block, being the very first transaction, so we can see somebody having bought something for 10,000, I think it was 10,000 Bitcoin, which right now would be worth about $158 million or something like of that variety. It was actually for 2 boxes of pizza. So that pseudo-anonymous nature of the platform lent itself to that. Now, what we're seeing is a ton of litigation, and particularly prosecutions or regulatory investigations in the capital market space. So who has heard of an initial coin offering or an ICO or a TGE? Okay, so it seems like quite a few of you have. So we're counsel on quite a number of cases where regulators, both here in Canada, like the Ontario Securities Commission or the AMF, the Quebec Securities Regulator, and also the United States Securities and Exchange Commission are saying, wait, these tokens that you're issuing are basically securities, and you didn't comply with securities laws. All of those people should have received a document called a prospectus, which gives disclosure and has to satisfy a very high standard of disclosure, full, true, and plain. And so we're seeing a lot of litigation in that area. We're seeing a lot of tax authorities now trying to make inquiries in this space as well. So they're seeing a lot of transactions occurring over exchanges, but in the United States, the US government or the IRS said we only have about 1,500 people who reported capital gains on their tax filings. There must be something wrong here. So they're making a lot of inroads. So that's the first part of your question. And then the second was, I completely forgot what your second question was. Go ahead.
It was just, what do you think businesses and individuals can do to protect themselves if they are involved in cryptocurrencies?
Hire Gowlings, that guy over there.
Yeah, so if you're involved in an ICO or an initial coin offering, one should seek proper advice prior to getting into those, because you may, in fact, be entitled to rights under securities legislation to protect you. And oftentimes these are sold as utility tokens where they say they're not securities. And therefore you get, sometimes in the early days, you know, it would pretty much be on a napkin or a 1 or 2 pager, the disclosure that these people would get. And then these projects would raise $300 million within 7 minutes. Or it was remarkable. I haven't seen anything like it. Now, people are starting to realize that securities laws apply and are issuing the proper documents, and we're assisting on a number of those. So that's just some advice I'd give, but oftentimes consult proper counsel.
This question is regarding TMX Group's innovative use of blockchain. Your company has been recently developing prototypes for businesses using blockchain technology. The Easy Proxy voting system that is meant to increase the efficiency and accuracy of the shareholder voting process, and another that tracks natural excuse me, gas flows and deliveries. How will the latter prototype increase the safety of natural gas flows, and what are the potential risks of using this new technology?
The nat gas flows, the natural gas is actually it's not a safety mechanism. So the dangers of getting physical delivery of natural gas from a well tip in Alberta to your house here in Ontario, those risks still exist. So blockchain is not going to be able to go and replace a physical pipe. But what we did there, and I kind of talk about this a little historically because the TMX group actually sold NGX, which is the nat gas exchange, this past December. But prior to that, what we were doing was actually the clearing and settlement of physical natural gas units. And what I mean by that is if you think about how that journey of natural gas actually gets from a well. I mean, everyone here lives in Toronto right now, and aside from today, this winter's been kind of crappy and it's been very, very cold. And when you go home, there's just a natural assumption that when you turn your furnace on, that there's gas there for you to burn. If you think about the journey of where that gas came from, it came from a well tip somewhere, and it made its way through a myriad of daisy chains of pipes that are not owned by one single entity. They're owned by separate operators that look after that little piece of that pipeline, and they work their way all the way to a municipality and then over to your home. If you think about the clearing and settlement of that, each company that is really daisy chained together is responsible for moving that unit however many miles or kilometers to actually get that gas moved across. It's technology. Sometimes there is danger, and sometimes the flow of natural gas has to stop. There might be a leak or whatever. And so when you do that, the failure to deliver becomes real. And so how do you track that? Who is liable? Who's responsible? That whole process is very, very manual, and it takes upwards of 30 days to figure out who failed to deliver in that whole daisy chain, who's the one that shouldn't fully get paid, who's the one that has to pay the penalty for failing to deliver that natural gas. If you think about blockchain and the nature of how you could actually commit the successful delivery of each of those things, you can now figure out who failed to deliver within seconds. At the end of every fiscal year for some of these companies, if you own shares of any particular company, there is a filing requirement to call an annual general meeting. And some of these things that happen, you get these wonderful physical mailings. You get a nice booklet that says, this is how much money the company made, this is how much money the company spent, your disclosure requirements, something that the smart guy over here was talking about as securities law requirement. As well, there's a piece of paper that says, oh, here's your vote. Who do you want to vote for your board of directors? Who do you want to vote in terms of your overall auditor? Who do you want to go and look at to approve the executive compensation program? You as a shareholder have these rights to actually go and place these votes. It's on a physical piece of paper. So when you think about how that gets tabulated at the annual general meeting, how do you think that gets done? Manually. So we go through a wonderful reconciliation process to ensure that eligible votes are actually counted as part of this. And this is, again, adhering to the integrity of the capital market system. And you actually go through a very laborious process to make sure that these votes that were counted are actually eligible. Now imagine what blockchain can do when you apply that technology. The tabulation is immediate. Who's eligible to vote is immediate. The lists of how you actually put it together, because they're bifurcated, the whole issue around privacy of who owns what has to be maintained. That's why they're split. Again, because of the immutable nature of the blockchain, as well as the privacy, you can actually tier this out. And that was our prototype to actually look to see if you can use that technology in a way to streamline this process. And if you can do it, you wouldn't need, I think it's 30 days to actually go through all of this, because take that, multiply that by the number of issuers that we have, which is around 4,500, and they all do their AGM in between April to July, and then you can quickly see the challenge that we have in just doing the tabulation to count these votes.
You are seen to be a leader on blockchain and distributed ledger technology, including its application to the capital markets. what influenced you to become so invested in the technology and law integration? And did you predict that cryptocurrency would have such a booming effect in the legal system? And I do have a random question as to when your book will be coming out.
So did I predict this? So I was sort of thrust into this area in part because our clients developed, maybe such as yourselves as well, some of you, this almost unhealthy obsession with the topic, and would constantly ask us for legal advice about what is blockchain technology, and so they got over the hump of Bitcoin, and they started to see that the revolution actually is the underlying technology. And then when they started looking at the underlying technology, they said, wait, this could potentially totally disrupt our lines of business. And so, and for those of you who are, I'm not sure how many of you read that piece by IBM on blockchain for dummies or Bitcoin for dummies, but I mean, look at our conventional system, right? So how do you go about doing a banking transaction? So you'll go to your bank, you want to send $5 to, let's say, Sahil over here in front of me, and you'll go to your bank, they'll confirm that you have a bank account, they'll check your ledger, being your debits and credits, make sure you have $5 to spend, and then through all these intermediaries, ultimately there'll be a communication to Sahil's bank, and that $5 will be ultimately deposited. Everyone's going to update their respective ledgers. So what about a world in which you can basically send that $5 to Sahil in a pristine, almost uninterrupted way without any of those intermediaries whatsoever? And it could be done quicker than the conventional system within, let's say, 10 minutes, regardless of whether he's sitting across a room from you or in Japan. And so banks started to consider this and said, oh, this might have an impact on many of our lines of business. Now throw in smart contracts and this automated way of doing things that sort of lives off of these blockchains, and then you have potential massive disruption to the capital markets, which is where my day job was prior to blockchain coming into my life. And then you have massive disruption to the insurance space. You have massive disruption to many, many different areas. I mean, like you even have Sweden, for example, moving to get rid of its entire land registry system to tokenize property and have it move through a blockchain distributed ledger technology platform or network. So to answer your question, how I got into this, I started to see that our clients were massively interested in this area. And then I'm not sure, John, if you had this moment as well, is that you read your first thing on blockchain and you have this moment, and a lot of these developers have this, Vitalik as well, and Anthony too, is that you find out about it and then you basically lock yourself in a room for 3 days not to emerge, just having read and not slept and just obsessed with what the implications of this technology are. That happened to me as well. And at that point I was hooked. And then I started to look at the implications from all legal spheres as to what's happening. And so that's how I got involved. And now I'm helping to advise cabinet ministers and prime ministers and this and that as to where this is all going, how to structure themselves, how to deal with this potential disruption that's coming. And I don't mean that word in any pejorative sense. I'm talking about the impact that it will have on many different ways of how we operate. So in terms of the book, it's scheduled for this year, and we're working hard to target for this year. That being said, the challenge in this area is that we're on the front lines, and this area is constantly shifting, and new legislation is constantly coming out, that it's hard to get any stability in any given chapter because the law keeps changing. So what we're thinking of doing is sort of rolling it out in pieces now and constantly updating that which is coming out and then ultimately bringing it together just so that at least we can start getting views out there in this space. So,
hi, John. So in April of 2017, TMX Group announced that it was launching its first blockchain-based prototype to maximize company efficiencies and find solutions to a variety of client issues on a daily basis. Given how recently implementation of this distributed ledger technology occurred, one could assume that TMX has spent the last several months adjusting to the new technology and exploring the benefits it poses to the organization. One could also assume that before this announcement last April, your organization had done a great deal of research and development for this blockchain application. Therefore, my question to you is, what was it like as the VP of Innovation and Enterprise Delivery to implement this application? Was it well received by employees using it, and in what ways did it live up to or not meet your expectations?
When you think about the disruptive nature of this technology, the first thing that I'll say is there are people that are really, really excited about it, but there's also a bank of folks that would look at that and go, wait a minute, this is completely disrupt and eliminate the need for my job. And so you did get a bit of mixed reviews, especially if you think about some of these prototypes where you actually go and apply it. So I should clarify that these prototypes, the technology components to it were very, very quick. They're very, very rapid to actually go and vet out. But it's a multi-pronged challenge because not only do you need to figure out how to operate it and run it, you also need to look at the business model as well. And so this has cultural elements too, because if you deploy this, let's say to an organization and you realize 40 of the jobs are no longer required. You can't just go and slap it in there and go, oh, by the way, you guys, go figure out, go do something else, figure something out. So, there's a socialization element and a cultural shift element that we really look at very, very carefully when we actually look and explore this. And a big part of the prototyping is actually to address this on multiple prongs. And so everyone always talks about the technology piece. The technology piece actually is by far the easiest because there's a beginning and an end. Here it is. The demo's workable. But then when you see the results of it, that's when the real work starts. You look and you go, wait a minute. This has massive regulatory implications. This has massive audit benefits, for example, in terms of traceability. Wait a minute, this completely eliminated the need for 3 different types of reconciliation. Hold on, in order for this to actually work, you need to get the entire banking system to actually go and adopt this. Hold on, if I do that, then their business operations would need to get impacted. And then you can start to quickly see how this becomes a massive ripple effect in terms of how you can actually go and move something into production. So it's not a simple challenge where you look at it from a multi-pronged approach. And so we learned a tremendous amount through that, the one thing that I will say is as we go and explore it, the hardest one was the cultural shift of the people. And if you look at people that have jobs that have been very, very skilled, very trained, know their job inside and out, and they've been doing this for 15 years, and then to find out that this technology can ultimately eliminate the need for it, that's not something that an average person can just say, oh, no problem, I'm good, And so there's a big transition in terms of retooling the people to look at the new emerging jobs and positions that this would actually create so that you can actually pivot and shift the workforce to actually make it real.
So what advice would you give these, what are you guys, 4th year, business students, got a legal business, smart, and when you're hiring, I want you hiring Ryerson students here. Just remember that.
Right?
But what advice would you both give to these students with respect to career paths and things like that as it relates to this particular industry? Because you said there's going to be more jobs. So we want to be ahead of the curve, and it was not anyone's question, but I'm asking it.
So I ironically was actually thinking about this for my kids, and I said, well, I'm almost positive that, being a typical Korean family grown up, my parents had this vision that in order for my kids to be successful, they have to be a doctor, they have to be a lawyer, or they have to be some sort of professional. Anything else in your crap, you're a complete failure. And so when you think about those elements, by that definition, I'm a complete failure, right? But what I've realized is, over the next 5 years, my advice to all of you is look at the industry trends. And when you think about the disintermediating elements, you will actually start to see the triggers. And then think about the implications to industry. think about the implications to regulatory, think about the implications to society as a whole, and you will see it is like a pebble in a pond where you're going to start to see these impacts. When that happens, it'll be pretty fast. When that happens, you will see massive gaps all over the place. So to try and figure out where that skill set would be needed would be, I would say, just go in and focus on that. And the one thing that I am seeing, especially when you think of the revolution, it is being empowered by very cheap computing power and a tremendous amount of technology enablement. And so if you think about those key areas, these are the areas that I would suggest exploring. And it doesn't mean you need to be a technologist. There's going to be a tremendous amount of support infrastructure to help foster and grow that.
Anything to add, Usman?
You know, at the end of the day, as we say to a lot of our law students or the students that we have that are young lawyers, is this profession is a marathon, it's not a sprint. You have to love what you're doing at the end of the day, okay? So that's the most primordial, basic of points. So whatever you do, you have to enjoy doing it because you're going to be doing it. I mean, nowadays, gone are the days of our fathers and mothers where you stick with a profession and you stay in a job for 50 years and that sort of thing. A lot of people end up switching and see career progression as picking up skills from here and picking up skills from there. And so you always have to enjoy, as the most basic point, what you're doing. That being said, you have to be smart about what you're doing as well. And so in my own career, for example, I saw that where this particular industry was going with blockchain and became a bit of a first mover in it. And I happen to really like it. I mean, blockchain, for example, is an area where, I mean, we're dealing with questions of first instance every single area that we look. I mean, like, what is Bitcoin? Is it a security? Is it a commodity? Is it property? Is it a new asset class? Is it a currency? Is it all of the above? I mean, like, these are questions that are fundamentally intellectually stimulating rather than just doing the kind of mundane sort of corporate commercial litigation case. Like, these are cases that a lot of us are fascinated by. So I would say, again, just go back to what you really enjoy and then be somewhat smart about where the winds are going. And if you're interested in law, we're now telling a lot of students that you should try to understand coding as well, because we see where the wind is going in that area with smart contracts. And at one point, we as lawyers are going to have to know whether the written text and the smart contract code, in fact, memorializes or reflects that written text in a contract. And have we as lawyers discharged our obligation to our clients if we don't know whether that code is actually implementing the intent behind that contract? So we actually have hired a number of students, I'm talking about law students in our coming class that do have that background and do understand that, and we are hiring coders as well, blockchain coders, and working on proofs of concepts of our own. So I guess you just have to understand where the trends are going.
So your biography says your litigation expertise includes crisis management. One recent and popular example of a crisis management disaster was the Equifax data breach. As of September 2017, at least 23 class action lawsuits were filed against Equifax. Andrevet Legal Media and Marketing says the value lost in diminished reputation may far outweigh the cost of litigation. My question is, in what ways can companies facing crisis mitigate damage to their brand or reputation? And should brand reputation or solving the crisis be a company's first priority?
Yeah, it's a little bit of a tougher question to ask because it sort of depends on the company, depends on the issues. But I mean, companies right now know that it's a brave new world, that it's a whole new different ballgame with cybersecurity threats and so on and so forth. And so, you know, on the data security side, a lot of companies now are really having an introspective moment to find out where the crown jewels are of the company. So personal data, where are they harboring it? So Equifax had quite a lot of personal data. And then what methods they can take to protect the integrity of that data, make sure that it doesn't get dissipated, either because of insiders who may have clicked on a phishing email scam and unbeknownst to them have suffered or gotten trapped in that, or a whole host of things are being looked at. Bringing this back to a little bit to the blockchain side, so it's interesting because our firm is hosting in, I think it's early to March, and Ralph, you might not actually know this, but we're hosting a roundtable on digital identity, and this is being co-hosted with the province of Ontario and DIAC. And so we're going to have the governor of the Bank of Canada, we're going to have a lot of the banks and many, many other key parties who are looking at how blockchain technology, and to use, I don't know if you've heard this book called The Blockchain Revolution, but it was authored by Don and Alex Tapscott. And so if you always talk to Don, he'll say, well, we'll be able to create, he uses the word, a digital avatar, basically a replica of ourselves electronically that holds all of our personal data, and will be able to be permissioned, and we'll be able to have complete control over the information that relates to us qua human being, and be able to control who gets access to it, be able to control how long that person may have access to that information through cryptography, et cetera, et cetera. And so John can maybe elaborate more on that digital avatar and the integrity of that. But that's considered to be a solution to a lot of this. And so if you look at blockchain technology, what is it trying to cure in part? Well, right now we have in our traditional system banks, we have clearing agencies, we have many, many other people or entities that basically all harbor personal information relating to an individual, that each in themselves can be attacked and be a source of data leakage. Now, what happens if you can create a digital representation of yourself, and that could be secured through the technology that is blockchain? And so I don't know, John, if you wanted to elaborate on any of that, but that's seen to be somewhat of a solution to what we're seeing with Equifax and other companies that are being attacked.
Yeah, I can tell you for the TMX group, brand and brand reputation is of paramount importance. If you think about our depository, which is part of the TMX group, it's been classified as something called an SFMI, which is a significant financial market infrastructure. And what that really means is this thing is trading or transacting about $1 trillion worth of asset value on any given day. And so for the investing community, when you trade through the Toronto Stock Exchange, there isn't a single person that has an issue with the fact that my money is there, I just bought a security, and now I'm worried that I'm not going to get the security. That just doesn't happen because there's just an implied trust. And we take a lot of precautions to ensure that the bad guys that would actually go in and try to do a cyber breach or anything like that can't get in to access the data. Because if you think about the old days where you had a physical stock certificate in a vault, there was a bit of security around that because it was a physical piece of paper. Right now, we're 99% dematerialized, which means a lot of these securities are already set up as digital assets, and it's one glorious ledger. And so the data and the precautions to ensure that the data doesn't get breached is significant. We have what's known as rings of defense, so that if a bad guy were to try and get in, not only would we detect that, but they still wouldn't be able to get into the core depository. And so these are some of the controls that we have to put in place to ensure that when there's money being transacted or assets being transacted, that the investor community doesn't have to worry about the fact that, oh, wait a minute, $500 million of so-and-so's portfolio just vanished. What just happened? That's not something that we tolerate. So if there was a data breach at the exchange, there would be significant implications to the country, to be honest, and that's why from a brand and brand reputation standpoint, we take a tremendous amount of time, energy, and resources to ensure that actually doesn't happen.
So the staff notice that was published by the CSA on August 24th. The notice describes the factors CSA staff consider in assessing whether prospectus, registration, and marketplace requirements apply. Do you think that this notice provided good guidance for the growing activity in this novel area? And in your opinion, what do you think is missing and should be added to strengthen or improve it?
So my personal view, and not that of the TMX group or the fact that I'm an advisor for the OSC.
You're being taped as your counsel.
You know, it was a first stab at it, and I think one of the biggest challenges around the whole token craze from last year, and I think I alluded to it earlier, is that all of these ICOs are not necessarily created equal. There are some very legitimate ICOs, but they're just completely crowded in a sea of potential fraud and the whole bit. So the space is confusing, and a big part of that is because of KYC, because of the lack of it, and if you think about the prospectus filings that you need to go through to ensure that the investment you're trying to issue is a legitimate investment, and the lack of that, it becomes difficult. And so one of the challenges that I would see that hopefully we can clarify, and I think Usman mentioned it earlier, this space is changing constantly. The laws are changing constantly as they try to be honest, keep up with the pace of how the technology is evolving. The classification of these tokens or these coins is something that hasn't been standardized. And so the default standard as a result of that is everything's a security. And the fact of the matter is some of these things actually are not, because they're not backed by an actual asset. And so I think as the space matures, there's going to become a classification of these tokens saying these are bad tokens, there's absolutely nothing here, to these are absolutely legitimate. And that hopefully will create a framework that will allow the CSA and the regulations to actually go and clarify their position a bit. And again, you know, one thing that I've learned is trying to change rules is not something you can do overnight. It takes a while.
The Ontario Securities Commission has been criticized in the past for being too lax on its security fraud dealings compared to its U.S. counterparts. Decisions in the OSC usually go to a tribunal, which require balance of probabilities. The legal process usually takes long, where witnesses die before they go to trial, and the U.S. security commissions are usually more willing to go after big fish in the industry because they want to send a message. In your opinion, what measures can the OSC take to step up its game and pose as a more effective deterrent for potential security infringers like its U.S. counterparts?
I used to be a prosecutor at the Ontario Securities Commission. So it's a good question. It's people properly put the indictment on not only the OSC but other regulators that they haven't stepped up to the level that, and as their American counterparts. And particularly of late, you may have seen the Globe has been going to town on this particular issue as well. And so there's a few things, I guess. So the first thing to appreciate is that our capital markets are much smaller than the United States, and it's hard to sort of compare apples and apples to the Americans and here. But that being said, it's a fair point to say in the United States that there's been a lot more criminal prosecutions by the Department of Justice and the New York Attorney's Office as well. There's a few things that need to change in Canada. So one, for example, like I used to be in the insider trading unit for the OSC. These are the hardest cases to prove. And the reason why is that it's very similar to, frankly, it's probably not the best analogy to make, but to communication for the purpose of prostitution. So in that circumstance, you have a crime that is unlawful under the criminal code, but you have no witness who is going to come readily to the authorities and say that I was victimized and therefore you need to prosecute. So same thing with insider trading and tipping. There's no, assuming all goes well, you don't really have a victim who is going to come to the regulator and say and give all their evidence like somebody would in an assault, for example. So what we have to do is build what I had to do in that circumstance is build a case based on circumstantial evidence, okay? So build it piece by piece, looking at the phone record, looking at the date and time of the trade, going back to the trade ticket and looking at the exact second and trying to fit this whole chronology to compel the commission to say on the balance of probabilities based on the wealth of evidence that we put before you that you should find that this individual did engage in insider trading or tipping. Okay, so we have a tool, the Americans have a tool in the United States that we don't have in Canada at this time, which facilitated a lot of criminal prosecutions in the US, which is the ability to wiretap, okay? So the ability to wiretap allows the criminal authorities, like the FBI, for example, to tap into the line of two people who are suspected of insider trading and tipping to capture contemporaneous evidence from the horse's mouth where they're actually conveying material non-public information from one person to the other, followed by a trade or what have you, to secure on a beyond a reasonable doubt basis that, that conviction. So that's how Preet Bharara, for many of his cases, was able to bring down many key players in Wall Street and others on the basis of that tool. So one thing that we're missing in Canada is those statutory amendments. There hasn't been that amendment to the criminal code to authorize wiretaps for criminal prosecutions. So I think that that's one reason, and then, you know, frankly, there's probably a whole host of others, but, you know, so I'm happy to chat with you afterwards, but I think that that's one of the things, some of the amendments as well, and the size of the prosecutorial teams are not exactly the same, et cetera, et cetera.
As of late in the news, there's been some applications from companies to create some sort of ETFs surrounding tracking cryptocurrencies and stuff like that. What do you recommend for an individual to get exposure to cryptocurrencies? And do you think that an ETF would be lucrative and a good investment tool for a person that wants to get minimal exposure to cryptocurrency?
I obviously can't give you investment advice because I'm not a licensed investment advisor, but ETFs are a mechanism by which you can get some exposure to it, and some of these ETFs that are being generated are operating under the confines of securities law. So, you know, if there is a way that you can get exposed to some of that, I should quantify the fact that you are getting into it and it's being managed. So there is going to be a basket of crypto, theoretically, that's going to be underpinning it. A very, very new instrument. You know, the ETFs actually have been around for a long time, but obviously this one being crypto is a little bit different. And so there is, you know, let's just say some caution around how that's moving forward. And I think that is an example of how you can kind of see Canada looking to transform or embrace some of this new technology. And just instead of just going straight all in, these are some of the, I'll call them innovations that are actually coming out to operate and get some exposure to this stuff without breaking the law. And this is, and that's a perfect example of that.
So my question is, since cryptocurrencies to some level pose as a competitor to existing currencies within nations, for example, Bitcoin and Canadian dollars accepted by a few merchants here in Canada, would you say that it is a possibility or a probability that we'll eventually see central banks across the world, and in particular in Canada, begin to issue their own digital currencies in an effort to maintain control over their domestic money supply?
John is working with the Jasper project, so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm actually trying to answer that question myself. And so what I can share with you is last November, the TMX, myself, Payments Canada, and the Central Bank, the Bank of Canada, have entered an agreement to go into a pilot project called Project Jasper. And that project, what that is meant to do was to literally put a Canadian dollar on a blockchain, which theoretically would compete with Bitcoin and Ether and the whole bit. Now, obviously, the implications of that, you can pretty much see what that would imply. The other element of that project is that we're introducing the assets, the securities, into that ecosystem. So when you do that and you try to understand the interaction model between a cash leg, which would be a Canadian dollar on a blockchain, to an asset or a security, again, on a blockchain that can now interact with each other instantaneously, what the hell happens? And that's the project.
Okay.
And we'll actually have the results of that in probably mid to late April.
Okay, if anyone wants to speak to the speakers after the class, I want to thank our two guests, John and Usman. Okay.